Christian Draymond had built walls around his heart so high that even his own daughter couldn't climb them until one summer afternoon when screams from Willow Creek Lake shattered his isolated world. A leather-clad woman from the Midnight Wolves Motorcycle Club was drowning alongside her young nephew, and without hesitation, Christian plunged into the treacherous waters. What began as a desperate rescue would reveal a connection spanning 15 years and transform not just two broken souls, but an entire community that had written off both the grieving widower and the misunderstood bikers. When the gang's true response to Christian's heroism comes to light, it will challenge everything you think you know about family, loyalty, and the courage to love again. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Christian Draymond moved through his days like a man underwater, each breath deliberate, each step measured, as if the weight of grief might finally pull him under if he moved too quickly. At 34, he carried himself with the careful precision of someone who had learned that feeling. Too much could break you completely. The morning alarm pierced through his apartment at exactly 5:30 a.m., just as it had every day for the past 3 years. Christian rolled out of bed, his bare feet hitting the cold hardwood floor of the small 2-bedroom apartment above Brennan's hardware store in downtown Thornfield Valley. The space was sparse, functional, devoid of anything that might be called decoration. A single photograph sat on the kitchen counter, him and his 7-year-old daughter Lucy, taken at last year's county fair. Her smile was radiant, gap-toothed, and completely trusting. His own expression in the photo looked strained, like a man trying to remember how to be happy for someone else's sake. Christian pulled on his work clothes, faded jeans, steel-toed boots, and a flannel shirt that had seen better days. He worked construction for Hillcrest Development, spending his days building other people's dreams, while his own seemed to crumble a little more each season. The physical labor suited him. It was honest, straightforward, and required enough concentration that his mind couldn't wander to places it shouldn't go. He checked his phone for the 3rd time that morning. No messages from his ex-wife, Sarah. Lucy was spending the summer with her and her new husband in Denver, arrangement that left Christian's apartment feeling like a tomb. Sarah had left him 2 years after the accident, claiming she couldn't watch him disappear into himself anymore. She wasn't wrong. After losing his younger brother Jake in a climbing accident that Christian blamed himself for, he had become a shadow of the man she married. The coffee maker gurgled to life as Christian stared out his kitchen window at the quiet Main Street below. Thornfield Valley was the kind of town where everybody knew everybody, where secrets were currency and kindness was often confused with nosiness. He had moved here from Portland after the divorce, seeking anonymity in a place where his past couldn't follow him. What he hadn't expected was how thoroughly a small town could adopt your grief, making it part of the local mythology. Mrs. Henderson, from the flower shop, would pat his arm every morning and tell him that time heals all wounds, while Pete from the gas station would nod knowingly and mention how his own brother had died young. These well-meaning interactions left Christian feeling like a living memorial to loss, a walking reminder to others of life's fragility. He finished his coffee standing at the counter, checking his phone once more for any word from Lucy. She had been gone for 6 weeks now, and their nightly video calls had dwindled to sporadic texts. Sarah claimed Lucy was adjusting well to her new life, making friends at summer camp, bonding with her stepfather. Christian tried to feel happy about this news, but mostly it felt like another small death, another piece of his life floating away where he couldn't reach it. The drive to the construction site took him past Willow Creek Lake, a popular spot for families and teenagers during the summer months. Christian had never stopped there, never even slowed down. Water held too many memories of Jake, of diving competitions and swimming lessons, of promises to always watch out for each other that he had ultimately failed to keep. At the job site, Christian lost himself in the rhythm of framing walls for what would become someone's forever home. His crew foreman, Tommy Valdez, had long since stopped trying to draw Christian into the usual construction site banter. The other guys respected his silence, understanding that some people carried their pain differently. Christian was reliable, skilled, and never complained. In the construction world, that was enough. During his lunch break, Christian sat alone in his truck, eating a sandwich he barely tasted while scrolling through photos of Lucy on his phone. There she was at horseback riding camp, her face flushed with excitement. Another photo showed her with a group of new friends, all of them making silly faces at the camera. Christian smiled despite himself, remembering when making Lucy laugh had been the easiest thing in the world. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. Lucy wants to know if she can stay an extra 2 weeks. They have a special art program she's excited about. Christian stared at the message for a long time before typing back, "Whatever makes her happy." The response came quickly. "Thank you for understanding." "She misses you." Christian set his phone aside and pressed his palms against his eyes. He missed everything about his old life, the chaos of Lucy's art projects scattered across the dining room table, her endless questions about how things worked, the way she would crawl into his bed during thunderstorms and fall asleep with her small hand tucked in his dot after the divorce. He had promised himself he would rebuild, would find a way to be the father Lucy deserved. But grief was a patient predator, and it had slowly consumed his energy for anything beyond basic survival. He went through the motions of living work, eat, sleep, repeat while feeling increasingly disconnected from any sense of purpose or joy. The afternoon sun was brutal as Christian and his crew worked on the roof installation. Sweat stung his eyes, and his hands were raw from gripping tools, but he welcomed the discomfort. Physical pain was manageable, controllable. It had clear causes and practical solutions, unlike the emotional weight he carried that seemed to have no remedy. As quitting time approached, Christian found himself dreading the empty evening ahead. He had developed elaborate routines to fill the hours, reorganizing his toolbox, deep cleaning his truck, reading construction manuals he had already memorized. Anything to avoid the silence that amplified his thoughts. He stopped at Morrison's Market on his way home, buying ingredients for a dinner he probably wouldn't finish. The teenage cashier, Amanda, always tried to make small talk, but Christian kept his responses polite and brief. He had learned that friendliness in small towns came with expectations of reciprocity, and he had nothing to give back. The evening stretched ahead of him like an empty highway. Christian knew he would call Lucy at 8 o'clock if she was available. They would talk for maybe 10 minutes about her day, her new friends, her plans for tomorrow. She would ask when she could come visit him, and he would deflect with questions about camp. The truth was, he wasn't sure his small apartment could contain both his grief and her brightness anymore. As Christian climbed the stairs to his apartment, he caught his reflection in the hallway mirror. He looked older than his 34 years, worn down by loss and isolation. Jake used to joke that Christian worried too much, thought too hard about everything. "Sometimes you just have to jump," Jake would say. "Trust that the water will catch you." But Christian had learned that water could be treacherous. That trust was a luxury he could no longer afford. Tomorrow would bring another day of measured steps, careful breathing, and the slow erosion of hope. He had no way of knowing that in less than 24 hours, the sound of desperate screams would shatter his carefully constructed walls, forcing him to choose between safety and salvation. Saturday mornings in Thornfield Valley moved at the pace of honey, slow and golden, filled with the sounds of lawnmowers and the distant laughter of families enjoying their weekend freedom. Christian had woken up later than usual, his body finally succumbing to exhaustion after another sleepless night, replaying conversations with Lucy that felt increasingly strained and distant. He decided to drive to Hillcrest Shopping Center to pick up supplies for a small carpentry project, anything to keep his hands busy and his mind occupied. The route took him directly past Willow Creek Lake, and for the first time in months, Christian found himself slowing down to look at the scene unfolding along the shoreline. The lake was alive with summer activity. Families had claimed spots along the sandy beach with colorful umbrellas and picnic blankets. Teenagers threw frisbees while their parents watched from folding chairs. The water sparkled under the afternoon sun, and Christian could hear the distant sounds of joy echoing across the lake, splashing, laughing, the kind of carefree happiness he had forgotten existed. But what caught his attention wasn't the typical family scene. Near the far end of the lake, where the water deepened and the current picked up from the creek's inlet, a group unlike any other had gathered. Even from a distance, Christian could see the distinctive silhouettes of motorcycles parked in a neat row along the access road. Chrome glinted in the sunlight, and leather-clad figures moved around the bikes with practiced ease. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The Midnight Wolves had rolled into Thornfield Valley about 6 months ago, setting up their headquarters at the old Iron Horse Tavern on the outskirts of town. Christian had heard the usual small-town whispers rumors about drug deals, violence, territory wars. But he had also noticed them at Morrison's Market, buying groceries like everyone else, their money as good as anyone's, their interactions with staff polite and unremarkable. As Christian drove closer, he could see the motorcycle club more clearly. There were maybe 15 of them, men and women ranging in age from early 20s to grizzled veterans in their 60s. Some sat on picnic tables drinking beer. Others tossed horseshoes in a makeshift pit they had created in the sand. It looked remarkably normal, almost peaceful. Christian pulled into the public parking area, telling himself he was just taking a break from driving, maybe getting some fresh air. The truth was more complicated. Something about the scene intrigued him, challenged his assumptions about who these people were beneath their leather vests and intimidating motorcycles. He walked toward the water, choosing a spot about 50 yards away from the biker gathering, close enough to observe, but far enough to avoid unwanted interaction. The late afternoon heat shimmered off the pavement, and Christian felt sweat beading on his forehead as he found a shaded spot beneath an old oak tree. The Midnight Wolves seemed to be having some kind of informal gathering, possibly a birthday party or celebration. Christian could see a woman in the center of the group, her long dark hair flowing from beneath a bandana, her laugh carrying across the water. She moved with confidence, clearly comfortable among these intimidating-looking men, and Christian found himself wondering about her story. Then he noticed the young person near the water's edge. A girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old, was playing at the shoreline while the adults socialized. She had built an elaborate sandcastle and was now wading into the lake to fill a plastic bucket with water for her moat. Christian watched as she ventured deeper, the water reaching her waist. Then her chest. Something felt wrong. Christian stood up straighter, his construction-trained eyes automatically assessing the situation. The girl was moving toward the area where Willow Creek fed into the lake, where the current was deceptive and the bottom dropped off suddenly. He had heard stories about that spot, experienced swimmers who had gotten into trouble when the creek's current caught them off guard. The dark-haired woman had noticed too. Christian could see her gesturing toward the water, calling out something he couldn't hear over the distance. But the girl was focused on her bucket, oblivious to the growing concern of the adults. Then it happened. One moment the girl was standing in chest-deep water, and the next she was gone, pulled under by the creek's invisible current. Christian heard the woman scream even from 50 yards away, a sound of pure terror that cut through every other noise like a blade. The woman ran toward the water without hesitation, her boots splashing through the shallows before she dove fully clothed into the lake. Christian could see her swimming powerfully toward where the girl had disappeared, but the current was working against her, pulling both of them toward the deeper section where the creek current created a dangerous underwater spiral. The other bikers were shouting now, some running toward the water, others grabbing ropes and life preservers that weren't designed for this kind of emergency. Christian realized with growing horror that none of them were strong enough swimmers to help in those conditions. The woman surfaced briefly, gasping for air, the girl limp in her arms. But the current immediately pulled them both under again, and Christian could see they were both in serious trouble. The girl appeared unconscious, and the woman was struggling to keep both their heads above water while fighting against a force that was clearly overpowering. Christian didn't remember making the decision to run. His feet were moving before his mind caught up, his work boots pounding against the sand as he sprinted toward the water. Behind him, he heard shouting from the midnight wolves, voices calling for someone to call 911, for someone to do something, anything. But Christian was already diving into Willow Creek Lake, his flannel shirt and jeans immediately weighing him down as the cold water shocked his system. He had been a competitive swimmer in high school, had lifeguarded summers during college, but that felt like a lifetime ago. His body moved on instinct, muscle memory taking over as he powered through the water toward the spot where he had last seen the woman and girl disappear. Current was stronger than he had expected, the water murky with sediment stirred up from the creek bottom. Christian dove under, his eyes burning as he searched through the brown water for any sign of movement. His lungs screamed for air, but he forced himself to stay under, sweeping his arms in wide arcs. Then his hand connected with something solid: leather jacket, human form. Christian grabbed hold and pulled, breaking the surface with the woman gasping and choking in his arms. Her dark eyes were wide with panic, and she was trying to speak through the water she was coughing up. "The girl," she managed to gasp. "Junessa, she's still under." Christian looked around frantically, realizing the current had carried them even further from shore. The woman, who he now realized must be Saphira Dreneth, based on her distinctive leather vest, was barely conscious, her strength depleted from her rescue attempt. "Can you float?" Christian asked urgently. Saphira nodded weakly, and Christian positioned her on her back before diving under again. This time he went deeper, following the current's flow, knowing that the girl would have been pulled in the same direction. His lungs were burning, his vision starting to blur from lack of oxygen, when his fingers brushed against something small and soft. Christian grabbed hold and pulled with everything he had, breaking the surface with the limp form of 9-year-old Junessa in his arms. She wasn't breathing. Christian fought against the current to reach shallower water, Saphira swimming weakly beside him. By the time they reached the beach, several of the midnight wolves were waist-deep in the water, ready to help pull them to shore. Christian immediately began CPR on Junessa, his training from years ago returning with crystal clarity. Chest compressions, rescue breathing, the rhythm as familiar as his own heartbeat. Saphira knelt beside him, her wet hair hanging in her face, her hands shaking as she touched her young companion's forehead. "Come on, baby," she whispered. "Come back to us." Double quotes. Christian continued the compressions, counting under his breath, refusing to give up. Around them, the midnight wolves formed a protective circle, their earlier party atmosphere replaced by tense silence. Then Junessa coughed, lake water spilling from her mouth as her eyes fluttered open. The collective exhale from the gathered bikers was audible, and Saphira immediately gathered the girl into her arms, tears streaming down her face. "You're okay," Saphira whispered, rocking back and forth. "You're okay, sweetheart." Christian sat back on his heels, his whole body shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline. He looked up to find himself surrounded by leather-clad bikers, their faces reflecting a mixture of gratitude, relief, and something else he couldn't quite identify. "You saved them both," said a gruff voice behind him. Christian turned to see a massive man with a gray beard and arms covered in tattoos. The man's vest identified him as Wolf, clearly a club leader, based on the deference the others showed him. "Anyone would have done the same," Christian said quietly. Struggling to catch his breath, Wolf shook his head slowly. "No, brother. Not everyone would have jumped into that current. Most people would have stood on shore calling for help that wouldn't have arrived in time. The sound of approaching sirens filled the air as paramedics and police responded to the 911 calls. But Christian found himself focused on Sapphira, who was still holding Junessa close, whispering reassurances while checking to make sure she was truly okay. When Sapphira finally looked up at Christian, her dark eyes held something he hadn't seen directed at him in years. Pure, uncomplicated gratitude mixed with something deeper. Something that made his chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. "Thank you," she said simply. But the weight of those two words carried everything that couldn't be spoken in that moment. Christian nodded, suddenly aware that something fundamental had shifted. For the first time in 3 years, he had acted without thinking, had chosen to risk everything for someone else's life. The walls he had built around his heart had cracked open in the space of those desperate minutes in the water. As the paramedics took over Junessa's care and began checking both Sapphira and Christian for signs of shock or injury, Christian realized he felt more alive than he had since Jake's death. The numb fog that had surrounded him for years had lifted, replaced by sharp awareness of everything around him, the concerned voices of the bikers, the warmth of the late afternoon sun on his wet skin, the way Sapphira kept glancing at him with those grateful, curious eyes. He had no way of knowing that this afternoon would be the beginning of something that would transform not just his life, but the entire community's understanding of family, loyalty, and the courage required to truly live. The paramedics arrived like a small army, their red and white ambulance kicking up dust as it pulled to the edge of Willow Creek Lake. Christian sat on a fallen log, watching as EMT professionals took over the care of Junessa and Sapphira, his wet clothes clinging to his skin and his heart still hammering from the adrenaline of the rescue. "Sir, we need to check you out too," said a young female paramedic with kind eyes and efficient movements. "Cold water shock can be dangerous, and you've been through significant physical stress." Christian nodded absently, allowing her to wrap a warming blanket around his shoulders and check his vital signs. But his attention kept drifting to the scene unfolding around him. The Midnight Wolves had transformed from a relaxed party group into something resembling a military unit, each member taking on specific roles without any apparent direction needed. Wolf, the massive club president, was coordinating with the police officers who had arrived with the ambulance, answering questions while keeping his tone respectful but firm. Other members were packing up their picnic supplies with practiced efficiency, making sure the area was clean and organized. A woman with short silver hair and intricate arm tattoos was collecting phone numbers from witnesses, ensuring everyone's contact information was available if needed later. But what struck Christian most was how they treated Sapphira and Junessa. These intimidating-looking bikers moved around the injured pair with the gentle care of experienced parents, offering water, dry towels, quiet words of comfort. There was nothing performative about their concern. This was clearly a family taking care of their own. "Your blood pressure is elevated, but that's normal after what you just went through," the paramedic told Christian. "Any chest pain? Difficulty breathing?" "I'm fine," Christian replied automatically, though he wasn't entirely sure that was true. His ribs ached from the exertion of swimming against the current, and his shoulders burned from the effort of pulling two people to safety. But those physical discomforts were nothing compared to the emotional upheaval he was experiencing. For 3 years, Christian had moved through life in a careful bubble of numbness, avoiding any situation that might require him to feel too much or risk too much. He had convinced himself that this emotional hibernation was necessary, that getting involved in other people's lives would only lead to more loss and pain. But when he had seen Sapphira and Junessa disappearing beneath the water, every one of those carefully constructed barriers had crumbled instantly. He hadn't thought about his own safety, hadn't calculated the risks or considered the potential consequences. He had simply acted, driven by an instinct he thought had died with his brother. "The little girl is going to be fine," the paramedic continued, following Christian's gaze toward where Junessa was now sitting up on a stretcher, wrapped in blankets and sipping warm sports drink. mild hypothermia, and some water in her lungs, but thanks to your quick response, there shouldn't be any lasting effects. Christian felt a wave of relief so intense it nearly knocked him over. He realized he had been holding his breath, waiting for confirmation that Junessa would be okay, that his desperate rescue attempt had actually worked. And Safira? He asked, surprised by how much her well-being mattered to him. The woman? She's tougher than she looks. Exhausted, a little banged up from fighting the current, but she be fine. She keeps asking about you, actually. Before Christian could process what that meant, Wolf approached, his massive frame casting a shadow over the medical area. Up close, Christian could see that the biker president was older than he had initially appeared, probably in his early 60s, with intelligent gray eyes that seemed to take in everything. "Brother," Wolf said, extending a hand that completely engulfed Christian's when they shook. "I need to thank you properly." "It's not necessary," Christian began, but Wolf held up a hand to stop him. "Yes, it is." "That woman over there?" Wolf gestured toward Safira, who was now arguing with a paramedic about whether she needed to go to the hospital. "She's not just a club member. She's family. And Junessa is her brother's kid, been staying with Safira since her brother deployed overseas 6 months ago." Christian felt something shift in his understanding of the situation. This wasn't just a biker taking care of a random young person. This was an aunt protecting her niece, a makeshift family doing their best to stay together during difficult circumstances. "The point is," Wolf continued, "you risked your life for people you don't even know. People most folks in this town cross the street to avoid. That tells me everything I need to know about your character." Christian looked around at the assembled midnight wolves, seeing them now through completely different eyes. These weren't the dangerous criminals his imagination had constructed. They were people complex, flawed, loyal people who happened to ride motorcycles and wear leather. "I saw 2 people in trouble," Christian said simply. "Anyone would have done the same thing." Wolf laughed, a deep rumbling sound that held no humor. "Brother, I've been riding these roads for 40 years, and I can count on one hand the number of times someone outside our community has stepped up when we needed help. Most people see the patches and the bikes and decide we're someone else's problem." A police officer approached, notepad in hand, ready to take Christian's statement about the incident. Christian answered the questions mechanically, his name, address, occupation, a basic description of what he had witnessed and how he had responded, any prior relationship with the victims. The officer asked, "No, I've never met them before today." The officer made a note, then looked up with obvious curiosity. "So you just happened to be here when this occurred?" Christian nodded, realizing how unlikely it sounded. He had driven past this lake hundreds of times without stopping, had actively avoided places where people gathered and enjoyed themselves. If he hadn't decided to take that particular route at that exact time, if he hadn't chosen to stop and observe the biker gathering, Safira and Junessa might have drowned before help arrived. "Lucky coincidence," the officer commented. Double quotes. "Yeah." Christian agreed, though he was beginning to wonder if luck had anything to do with it. As the official interview concluded, Christian found himself approached by various members of the Midnight Wolves. Each introduction revealed another layer of complexity that challenged his assumptions about who these people were. There was Maria, the silver-haired woman with the arm tattoos, who worked as a nurse at Thornfield Valley General Hospital and had been in the middle of her vacation day when the emergency occurred. Tony, a quiet man in his 40s, turned out to be a high school math teacher who rode with the club on weekends. Susan, a woman about Christian's age, ran a successful catering business and had been planning to provide food for their gathering. Each conversation chipped away at the stereotypes Christian had unconsciously absorbed about motorcycle clubs. These were teachers, healthcare workers, small business owners, people with jobs and families and responsibilities, united by their love of riding and their loyalty to each other. But it was when Safira finally extracted herself from the paramedics and walked over to him that Christian felt the yucca full impact of what had happened. "They tell me you saved my life," she said, her voice still hoarse from swallowing lake water. Sapphira Drenith was not what Christian had expected. Her leather vest and motorcycle boots suggested toughness, but her eyes held a warmth and intelligence that immediately put him at ease. She was probably in her early 30s, with olive skin and dark hair that had dried into soft waves around her shoulders. When she smiled, Christian noticed a small scar above her left eyebrow that somehow made her face more interesting rather than less attractive. "I just did what needed to be done," Christian replied, feeling suddenly self-conscious about his own appearance. His work clothes were still damp and covered in lake sand, and he probably looked like he had been dragged through a creek, which technically he had. "Junessa is my niece," Sapphira explained. "Her father is deployed in Germany, and her mother passed away 2 years ago. She's been staying with me while he finishes his tour. If something had happened to her ... quotes, her voice broke slightly, and Christian could see the weight of responsibility she carried. This woman wasn't just caring for a relative's young person out of obligation. She loved Junessa deeply, had taken on the role of parent with complete dedication. "She's going to be fine," Christian said gently. "Kids are resilient." Sapphira nodded, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. "The paramedics want to take us both to the hospital for observation, but I hate leaving the guys to clean up this mess. We were supposed to be celebrating Tony's promotion to department head, and instead ... Instead you reminded everyone what family really means," Wolf interrupted, joining their conversation. "Tony understands." "We all do." Christian watched the interaction between Sapphira and Wolf, noting the obvious affection and respect they had for each other. This wasn't a hierarchical relationship based on fear or intimidation. It was more like a protective older brother looking out for his younger sister. "Listen," Wolf said, turning to Christian. "I know we just met, but I'd like to invite you to join us for dinner tomorrow night. Nothing fancy, just burgers and beer at the Iron Horse. It's the least we can do to thank you properly." Christian's immediate instinct was to decline. Social situations made him uncomfortable now, and he couldn't imagine what he would have in common with a motorcycle club. But something about the genuine warmth in Wolf's invitation, and the way Sapphira was looking at him with hopeful eyes, made him hesitate. "I don't know," Christian began. "Please," Sapphira said quietly. "I'd really like to thank you when I'm not half drowned and covered in lake water." Christian looked around at the assembled midnight wolves, all of whom were watching this exchange with obvious interest. For the first time in years, he felt like he belonged somewhere, like his presence mattered to people beyond just his ability to show up and do his job. "Okay," he heard himself saying. "I'd like that." The smile that spread across Sapphira's face was like sunrise after a long night, and Christian felt something deep in his chest stir to life, something he had thought was dead forever. As the ambulance prepared to transport Sapphira and Junessa to the hospital for precautionary examination, Christian realized that jumping into Willow Creek Lake had done more than save 2 lives. It had given him back his own. The Iron Horse Tavern sat at the intersection of 2 country roads, a weathered building that looked like it had been transplanted from a 1950s highway movie. Christian pulled his pickup truck into the gravel parking lot on Sunday evening, his stomach tight with an anxiety he hadn't felt since high school. The neon sign buzzed and flickered above the entrance, casting red and blue shadows across the rows of motorcycles, parked with military precision near the front door. Christian had changed clothes 3 times before settling on clean jeans and a button-down shirt, not too formal, but respectful enough for people who had invited him into their community. He sat in his truck for a full minute, watching through the tavern's windows as the midnight wolves moved around inside, their familiar leather vests creating a sense of unity and belonging he hadn't experienced since his construction crew days in Portland. The door chimed when Christian entered, and conversations paused just long enough for heads to turn and acknowledge his arrival. Wolf raised a beer bottle in greeting from behind the bar, and several club members called out welcomes that seemed genuinely warm rather than politely obligatory. "Christian, over here." Saphira's voice cut through the comfortable chatter, and Christian turned to see her waving from a corner booth near the tavern's stone fireplace. She looked completely different than she had the day before at the lake. Gone were the wet leathers and the expression of desperate terror. Tonight, Saphira wore dark jeans and a soft gray sweater that complemented her olive skin tone. Her dark hair fell in loose waves past her shoulders, and when she smiled, Christian noticed she had dimples that transformed her entire face. "How's Junessa?" Christian asked as he slid into the booth across from her, completely recovered and already planning her next adventure. Saphira laughed. "The hospital released us last night with instructions to take it easy. But try explaining taking it easy to a 9-year-old who thinks she's invincible. She gets that confidence from somewhere," Christian observed, studying Saphira's face. "Probably from growing up around this crew." Saphira gestured toward the assembled bikers. "They've spoiled her completely. She has 15 surrogate uncles and aunts who would do anything for her." Wolf appeared at their table carrying 2 beer bottles and a plate of wings that smelled like heaven. "Christian brother, what can I get you to drink?" "First round's on the house, obviously. Just a beer." "Thanks," Christian replied, accepting the cold bottle gratefully. "These wings are Tony's specialty," Wolf explained, setting down the plate. "Man teaches calculus all week, but he makes the best buffalo sauce in 3 counties. As Wolf moved away to greet other patrons, Christian found himself alone with Saphira in the cozy booth. The fire crackled nearby, casting dancing shadows on the tavern's wood-paneled walls, and the ambient noise of conversation created a sense of privacy despite being surrounded by people. "So tell me about yourself," Saphira said, leaning forward slightly. "I know you're in construction, and I know you're brave enough to jump into dangerous water to save strangers. But that's about it." Christian took a sip of his beer, buying time while he figured out how much of his story he was ready to share. "Not much to tell, really. I moved here from Portland about 2 years ago after my divorce. Work construction for Hillcrest Development. Live in a small apartment above the hardware store downtown. That's the facts," Saphira said gently. "But what about the rest? What made you leave Portland? What brings you joy?" The questions hit deeper than Christian had expected. When was the last time someone had asked him about joy? When was the last time he had experienced it? "I have a daughter," Christian said finally. "Lucy. She's 7, lives with my ex-wife in Denver. She's spending the summer there, doing camps and activities. That must be hard, being separated from her." Christian nodded, surprised by how easily Saphira seemed to understand the complexity of his situation. "The divorce was difficult. I wasn't in a good place emotionally, and Sarah thought Lucy would be better off with some distance while I figured things out." "Are you figuring things out, I mean?" Christian considered the question seriously. "I thought I was. I had my routines, my work, my quiet life. Then yesterday happened, and now I'm not sure about anything." Saphira smiled, and Christian felt that same stirring in his chest he had experienced at the lake. Sometimes the best changes come when we're not looking for them. Their conversation was interrupted by Junessa herself, who appeared beside their table like a small whirlwind of energy. She looked completely recovered from her ordeal, her cheeks flushed with excitement and her eyes bright with curiosity. "Aunt Saphira, can I show Christian my new bracelet? Maria taught me how to make it." "Of course, sweetheart," Saphira said, making room for Junessa to sit beside her. Junessa climbed onto the bench and proudly displayed a woven bracelet made from colorful cord. "Maria says it's called a friendship bracelet, and you give them to people who are special to you." She looked up at Christian with the serious expression that only young people can manage when discussing important matters. "I made one for you too, because you saved my life and Aunt Saphira's life, and that makes you part of our family now." Junessa pulled a second bracelet from her pocket, this one woven in blues and grays that somehow reminded Christian of lake, water, and held it out to him with ceremonial solemnity. "Junessa, that's very thoughtful," Christian said, genuinely moved by the gesture. "But you don't need to." "Yes, I do," Junessa interrupted firmly. "When someone saves your life, they become responsible for you forever. That's what Wolf says. So now you're stuck with us." Christian looked from Junessa's determined face to Saphira's amused expression, feeling a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the tavern's fireplace. He allowed Junessa to tie the bracelet around his wrist, marveling at her careful concentration as she worked. "There," Junessa declared when she finished. "Now you're officially part of the Midnight Wolves family." "I'm honored," Christian said, and meant it completely. As Junessa skipped away to show Maria her handiwork, Saphira leaned back against the booth's cushioned seat, studying Christian with those perceptive dark eyes. "She's not wrong, you know," Saphira said quietly. "About the family part. This community doesn't take adoption lightly, but when they decide someone belongs, that person belongs forever. I've never been part of anything like this," Christian admitted, gesturing toward the tavern full of bikers who were treating him like he had always been there. "What was your family like growing up?" Christian felt the familiar tightness in his throat that always accompanied thoughts of his family. "Small, just me and my younger brother Jake and our parents. Jake died 3 years ago in a climbing accident." "My fault." The words hung in the air between them, heavier than Christian had intended. He immediately regretted the admission, afraid he had revealed too much too quickly. But Saphira didn't pull away or change the subject. Instead, she reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, her touch warm and steady. "I'm sorry," she said simply. "Losing family is the hardest thing in the world. What about you?" Christian asked, grateful for her understanding but wanting to shift the focus away from his grief. "Tell me about your family." Saphira's expression grew more complex, a mix of love and sadness crossing her features. "Complicated," she said. "My brother Marcus is deployed overseas military communications specialist. His wife, Junessa's mother, died in a car accident 2 years ago. Brain aneurysm while she was driving. Completely unexpected. So you stepped in to take care of Junessa." Without hesitation, Saphira said firmly. "Marcus was a wreck, understandably. He had 8 months left on his deployment when Rebecca died, and the military wouldn't release him early unless he could prove Junessa had stable care. So I moved from San Antonio to here, found a job, established legal guardianship. Whatever it took." Christian studied her face, seeing the fierce loyalty beneath her calm exterior. "What kind of work do you do?" "I'm a paramedic," Saphira said, and suddenly several pieces clicked into place for Christian. "I work for Thornfield Valley Emergency Services. That's why I knew enough to keep Junessa calm while you were doing CPR yesterday. I've been on the other side of those situations more times than I can count. A paramedic who rides with a motorcycle club." Christian mused. "That's not what I would have expected." Saphira laughed, and the sound was infectious. "I get that a lot. People see the leather and the bikes and assume we're all criminals or rebels. Truth is, most of us are pretty ordinary. Wolf owns 3 auto repair shops across the county. Maria works at the hospital. Tony teaches high school. Susan runs her catering business. Then why the club? Why the motorcycles and the leather?" Saphira considered the question, absently running her finger around the rim of her beer bottle. "Because sometimes you need a family that chooses you, not one you're born into. Because there's something about riding together, about having people who will drop everything to help you, that creates bonds most people never experience." She paused, looking around the tavern at her club family. "And because when life gets complicated, when your brother deploys and you're suddenly responsible for a traumatized little girl, you need people who understand that family means showing up, no matter what." Christian followed her gaze, seeing the Midnight Wolves through new eyes. Tony was helping Junessa with what looked like math homework. his patience evident as he explained concepts in terms she could understand. Maria was deep in conversation with an older member about motorcycle maintenance, their technical discussion revealing expertise and mutual respect. Wolf was behind the bar, but Christian could see him keeping an eye on every interaction, ensuring everyone felt included and welcome. "I can see why Junessa feels safe here," Christian said. "She's been through so much loss for someone so young," Safira agreed. "Her mother's death, her father's deployment, adjusting to living with me in a new town. But this community has given her stability and love. They've given us both a place to belong. And now they're trying to give me the same thing." Christian realized. Safira smiled, her eyes warm with understanding. "If you want it. No pressure, no expectations. But the invitation is genuine." Christian looked down at the friendship bracelet Junessa had tied around his wrist, then back at Safira's face. For the first time in 3 years, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. "I want it," he said quietly. "I want to belong somewhere again." "Then welcome home," Safira said, raising her beer bottle in a small toast dot as their bottles clinked together. Christian felt something shift deep inside him. The walls he had built around his heart were crumbling, replaced by something stronger and more lasting, the possibility of hope, of connection, of a future that included more than just survival. The Iron Horse Tavern had become more than just a restaurant. It had become sanctuary, the first place in years where Christian felt truly safe to be himself. The following week passed differently than any Christian had experienced since moving to Thornfield Valley. Instead of his usual routine of work, solitary dinner, and early sleep, he found himself drawn into the orbit of the midnight wolves in ways both subtle and profound. It started with small things. On Tuesday morning, he discovered a thermos of excellent coffee waiting on his truck's hood when he came down from his apartment. A note tucked under the windshield wiper read, "Thanks for being family." The wolves. The handwriting was feminine and careful Safira's. He realized with a smile that surprised him with its warmth. Wednesday brought an invitation to join Tony for lunch at a small diner near the high school where he taught. What Christian expected to be a casual meal turned into a fascinating conversation about education, community responsibility, and the challenges of reaching students who felt like outsiders. "You know what strikes me about you," Tony said over burgers and fries. "You see people. Really see them. Most folks look at our club and make assumptions, but you looked past the leather and saw who we actually are." "I had help," Christian admitted. Safira and Junessa made it pretty hard to maintain any stereotypes. Tony grinned. "Those two have that effect on people. Safira, especially. She has this gift for seeing the best in everyone, even when they can't see it themselves." On Thursday evening, Christian received a text from Safira. "Junessa has a school presentation about heroes tomorrow. Would you consider coming? She's writing about you, and I think it would mean the world to her." Christian stared at the message for a long time. The idea of being called a hero made him deeply uncomfortable. Heroes were people like Jake, who had died trying to help others, not people like him who had failed to prevent tragedy. But the thought of disappointing Junessa was worse than his discomfort with the attention. He texted back, "What time should I be there?" Friday afternoon found Christian sitting in a 4th grade classroom decorated with colorful posters about community helpers and local landmarks. He felt conspicuously large in the child-sized plastic chair, but Junessa's teacher, Mrs. Patterson, had welcomed him warmly and seemed genuinely pleased that he had come to support one of her students. Junessa stood at the front of the fun of her students' class wearing a carefully pressed dress and clutching index cards covered in her neat handwriting. When she spotted Christian in the audience, her face lit up with a smile that made his chest tighten with unexpected emotion. "My presentation is about everyday heroes," Junessa began, her voice clear and confident. "Most people think heroes wear capes or have superpowers. But real heroes are people who help others, even when it's scary or hard." She went on to describe the events at Willow Creek Lake, but her version focused less on the drama of the rescue and more on the choice Christian had made to get involved. She talked about how heroes don't always look like what you expect, and how sometimes the most important heroic acts happen when no one is watching. Mr. Christian didn't know me or my Aunt Sapphira, Junessa continued. He could have stayed safe on the shore and called for help, but he chose to jump in the water because that's what heroes do. They act when people need them. Christian felt his throat tighten as Junessa concluded her presentation with a question for her classmates. Who are the everyday heroes in your life? After the presentations ended and the other families had left, Christian lingered in the hallway with Sapphira and Junessa. The little girl had changed from her presentation dress into jeans and sneakers, but she still carried herself with the pride of someone who had accomplished something important. That was incredible, Christian told her. You're a natural speaker. Aunt Sapphira helped me practice, Junessa said, slipping her hand into Sapphira's. She says if you have something important to say, you should say it clearly so people can understand. Your aunt is very wise, Christian agreed, catching Sapphira's eye over Junessa's head. As they walked toward the parking lot, Sapphira fell into step beside Christian, while Junessa skipped ahead, collecting interesting rocks and leaves for her nature collection. Thank you for coming, Sapphira said quietly. It meant everything to her to have you there. It meant something to me too, Christian admitted. I've never been anyone's hero before. I find that hard to believe, Sapphira said, studying his profile. You strike me as someone who's been quietly taking care of people your whole life. Christian thought about that as they reached his truck. It was true that he had always been the responsible one looking out for Jake when they were kids, working extra jobs to help pay for their parents' medical bills, taking on the role of provider and protector in his marriage to Sarah. But none of that had felt heroic at the time. It had just felt necessary. Would you like to come over for dinner tomorrow night? Sapphira asked. Nothing fancy, just pasta and salad. Junessa wants to cook for you as a thank you. Christian hesitated, not because he didn't want to accept the invitation, but because the offer felt significant in a way that both excited and terrified him. Dinner at someone's home was different from meeting at the tavern, more intimate, more personal. I'd like that, he said finally. Sapphira's apartment was located in a converted Victorian house on the quiet end of Maple Street, just a few blocks from downtown Thornfield Valley. When Christian arrived on Saturday evening, carrying a bottle of wine and a small potted plant he had impulsively bought at the garden center, he was struck by how perfectly the setting reflected Sapphira's personality. The apartment was warm and inviting, filled with comfortable furniture that looked like it had been collected over time rather than purchased all at once. Bookshelves lined one wall, packed with everything from medical textbooks to fantasy novels. Junessa's artwork covered the refrigerator, and photos of family and friends created a gallery wall near the dining area. Welcome to our home, Sapphira said, accepting the wine and plant with genuine pleasure. Junessa's been cooking since noon. I think she's determined to make this the best meal you've ever had. Junessa appeared from the kitchen wearing an apron that was clearly too big for her, flour dusting her hands and a look of intense concentration on her face. Christian, I'm making homemade pasta. Aunt Sapphira showed me how to use the machine. I can't wait to try it, Christian said, following her into the kitchen. The next hour passed in a comfortable blur of cooking, conversation, and laughter. Junessa insisted on demonstrating every step of her pasta-making process, from mixing the dough to feeding it through the machine that created perfect fettuccine noodles. Sapphira worked on the salad while keeping up a running commentary that made even the most mundane tasks seem entertaining. Christian found himself relaxing in ways he hadn't experienced in years. The domestic warmth of the scene reminded him of the best moments from his marriage, the times when he and Sarah had worked together in the kitchen, when Lucy had been small enough to stand on a chair to help with dinner preparation. But this felt different too. There was no underlying tension, no sense that he was performing happiness rather than experiencing it. Sapphira and Junessa accepted him exactly as he was, without any expectation that he be anything other than present and authentic. During dinner, Junessa regaled Christian with stories about her classmates, her teacher, and her ongoing pen pal correspondence with her father overseas. She spoke about Marcus with obvious love and pride, but without the sadness Christian had expected. This was a young person who had processed her losses and learned to live fully despite them. Dad says he might get to come home for Christmas, Junessa told Christian. He wants to meet you because Aunt Sapphira wrote him all about how you saved us. I'd like to meet him too, Christian said, realizing he meant it. The idea of being part of their extended family network no longer felt overwhelming. It felt like a privilege. After dinner, while Junessa worked on homework at the kitchen table, Christian helped Sapphira clean up. They moved around each other in the small kitchen with an easy rhythm, their conversation flowing naturally from serious topics to playful banter. Can I ask you something? Sapphira said as she rinsed the pasta pot. Of course. What made you stop at the lake that day? You said you'd never been there before. Never really noticed it despite driving past regularly. Christian dried a plate carefully, considering how to answer. I honestly don't know. I was supposed to go to the hardware store, but I took a different route. When I saw your group gathered there, something made me curious. I wanted to understand who you all really were beneath the assumptions I'd made. And what did you discover? That I'd been wrong about almost everything, Christian said. That family isn't always about blood relations, and that courage comes in many forms. Sapphira turned to face him fully, soap bubbles clinging to her hands. You know, Wolf told me something interesting yesterday. He said in 40 years of riding, he's never seen anyone outside the club move so quickly to help one of us. He thinks you were meant to be there that day. What do you think? Christian asked. Sapphira smiled, and Christian felt his heart skip in a way that had nothing to do with physical exertion. I think some connections are too strong to be accidental. I think you were exactly where you needed to be, exactly when we needed you most. As the evening wound down and Christian prepared to leave, Junessa presented him with another handmade gift, a small photo album containing pictures from her school presentation, along with photos from their evening at the Iron Horse Tavern. So you don't forget us, she explained. Seriously, I could never forget you, Christian assured her, and knew he was telling the complete truth. Standing on Sapphira's front porch, Christian felt the familiar reluctance to end an evening that had brought him more joy than he had experienced in years. The night air was cool and sweet with the scent of honeysuckle, and lights glowed warmly in windows throughout the quiet neighborhood. Thank you, he said to Sapphira. For dinner, for including me, for everything. Thank you for giving us a chance, she replied. And for letting us give you one too. As Christian drove home through the quiet streets of Thornfield Valley, he realized that the friendship bracelet Junessa had made him had become more than just a colorful accessory. It was a symbol of belonging, a reminder that he was no longer navigating life alone. For the first time since Jake's death, Christian felt genuinely hopeful about the future. The walls around his heart had crumbled completely, replaced by something infinitely stronger, the courage to love and be loved again. 3 weeks after the rescue at Willow Creek Lake, Christian had settled into a rhythm that felt more like living than surviving. His evenings now included regular dinners with Sapphira and Junessa, weekend rides with the Midnight Wolves he'd borrowed Wolf's spare motorcycle to learn, and a sense of belonging he hadn't experienced since before Jake's death. It was during one of these peaceful Saturday afternoons, while helping Sapphira organize old photographs for a scrapbook project Junessa had started, that the past came rushing back with devastating clarity. Oh, here's one I forgot I had, Sapphira said, pulling a faded photograph from the bottom of a shoebox. This was taken about 15 years ago when I was still in high school. My family took a camping trip to Pine Ridge State Park. Christian glanced up from the stack of photos he was sorting. But when his eyes focused on the image in Saphira's hand, his entire world tilted sideways. The photograph showed a teenage girl with long dark hair and a bright smile, standing next to a makeshift climbing wall at what was clearly an outdoor adventure camp. But it wasn't Saphira's face that made Christian's blood freeze. It was the young man in the background, maybe 19 years old, wearing a red instructor's shirt and helping another climber with their harness. Christian knew that face because it was his own. 15 years younger and full of the confidence he had possessed before loss taught him to fear everything. "Where did you say this was taken?" Christian asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Pine Ridge State Park," Saphira repeated, still smiling at the memory. "My family went there for my 16th birthday. There was this amazing adventure program, rock climbing, rappelling, wilderness survival skills. I was terrified of heights, but there was this instructor who spent extra time with me, helped me overcome my fear." Christian's hands began to shake. Pine Ridge State Park, the summer of 2009. He had worked there as a climbing instructor for 3 months before starting his junior year of college, earning money to help pay for tuition while Jake finished high school. What was the instructor's name? Christian managed to ask. Saphira looked more closely at the photograph, her brow furrowing in concentration. "I remember he was really patient and kind. His name was Chris something. Chris Draymond, I think. He had this way of making you feel brave even when you were scared." Photograph slipped from Saphira's fingers and fluttered to the floor between them. Christian bent to pick it up, his mind racing through memories he had carefully buried beneath years of grief and self-blame. That summer at Pine Ridge had been one of the best of his life. He and Jake had been planning to work there together, but Jake had gotten a last-minute opportunity to travel to Europe with friends before starting college. Christian had taken the job alone, spending his days teaching teenagers to trust ropes and harnesses and their own courage. He remembered the girl, now Saphira, though he had known her as Sophie back then. She had been part of a church youth group that had come for a week-long retreat. 16 years old, terrified of heights, but determined to overcome her fear because her younger brother had teased her about being afraid of everything. "I remember you," Christian said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "You were with the Baptist youth group from San Antonio. You were afraid to climb higher than 10 feet off the ground." Saphira's eyes widened, her hand flying to her mouth. "Chris Draymond. Oh my God, you're Chris. You're the instructor who spent 2 hours with me on the bunny slope, talking me through every single move until I finally made it to the top. You cried when you rang the bell at the summit." Christian remembered, the details flooding back with startling clarity. Happy tears. "You said it was the first time you had ever done something that scared you, and you told me that courage wasn't about not being afraid," Saphira continued, her voice beginning to shake. "You said courage was about being afraid and doing it anyway." They stared at each other across the coffee table, 15 years of separation dissolving in an instant. Christian could see the scared 16-year-old in Saphira's face, just as she was clearly seeing the confident young instructor in his. "That week changed my life," Saphira said softly. "I went home and started taking risks I never would have considered before. I applied for colleges outside of Texas. I chose paramedicine because it required the kind of courage you taught me I had. I learned to ride motorcycles because they scared me, and I wanted to prove I could do scary things." Christian felt tears burning his eyes. "And 15 years later, that courage you learned helped you try to save Janessa when she was drowning, which brought us back together," Saphira whispered. Saphira whispered. The weight of the revelation settled between them like a physical presence. This wasn't coincidence or luck. This was the universe completing a circle that had begun with a scared teenager learning to trust herself on an artificial rock wall. "There's more," Christian said, his throat tight. "That summer at Pine Ridge, I was supposed to work there with my younger brother Jake, but he had an opportunity to travel to Europe with friends, so I took the job alone. Saphira nodded, sensing there was more to the story. 3 years ago, Jake died in a climbing accident. He was leading a group up Mount Hood when his anchor failed. I blamed myself because I was the one who had taught him to climb, who had gotten him into mountaineering in the first place. Christian, Saphira breathed, reaching across the table to take his hands. I gave up climbing after his death. Gave up teaching people to take risks. I convinced myself that encouraging others to be brave was dangerous, that I was responsible for every accident that happened to someone I had trained. But you weren't responsible for Jake's accident, Saphira said firmly. Just like you weren't responsible for what happened to me and Junessa at the lake, weren't I? Christian asked. If I hadn't taught Jake to climb, then he might never have experienced the joy and confidence that climbing gave him, Saphira interrupted. Just like if you hadn't taught me to be brave, I might never have had the courage to become a paramedic, to take guardianship of Junessa, to build the life I have now. Christian looked down at their joined hands, seeing the friendship bracelet Junessa had made him still tied around his wrist. I can't believe you're the same person. That scared 16-year-old who was afraid of everything. I can't believe you're the same instructor who made me feel like I could do anything, Saphira replied. What happened to that confidence? That certainty that fear was just something to work through? It died with Jake, Christian said simply. No, Saphira said, her grip on his hands tightening. It went underground. It was still there when you jumped into Willow Creek Lake. It was still there when you chose to trust us enough to become part of our family. Junessa chose that moment to bound into the living room, her arms full of craft supplies for their scrapbook project. She stopped short when she saw the emotional intensity between the adults. Are you guys okay? She asked with the perceptive concern that only young people possess. We're more than okay, Saphira said, wiping tears from her cheeks. We just discovered that Christian and I knew each other a long time ago, before you were even born. Really? Junessa's eyes lit up with excitement. That's so cool. It's like destiny brought you back together. Christian looked at Junessa, then at Saphira, then down at the photograph that had started this revelation. Maybe it was destiny. Maybe it was coincidence. Or maybe it was simply the universe's way of reminding him that the best parts of himself, the parts he thought had died with Jake, were still alive, waiting for the right moment to resurface. Yeah, Christian said, his voice stronger than it had been in years. I think maybe it is. As they spent the rest of the afternoon looking through photographs and sharing memories, Christian felt something fundamental shift inside him. The guilt and self-blame he had carried since Jake's death didn't disappear, but they transformed into something more manageable grief that honored his brother's memory rather than punishing himself for surviving. And for the first time since the climbing accident, Christian began to believe that teaching people to be brave wasn't dangerous. It was the most important work anyone could do. The revelation about their past connection had changed something fundamental between Christian and Saphira, but it had also opened wounds that Christian wasn't sure he was ready to face. For several days after discovering the photograph, he found himself pulling back emotionally, canceling dinner plans and avoiding the easy intimacy they had been building. It was Wolf who finally cornered him about his behavior. Brother, we need to talk, the massive biker said, appearing at Christian's construction site during lunch break on a Tuesday afternoon. You've been ghosting us for almost a week, and Saphira's worried she did something wrong. Christian set down his sandwich, knowing this conversation was inevitable. It's not her fault. It's me. I just need some time to process everything. Process what, exactly? Wolf pulled up a piece of lumber and sat down across from Christian. The fact that you and Saphira have a history? That your paths crossed before? That maybe this thing between you is more than just coincidence? Process the fact that I'm apparently some kind of curse, Christian said bitterly. Everyone I teach to be brave, Everyone I encourage to take risks ends up getting hurt. First Jake, now I find out I'm the one who taught Saphira to be fearless, and she almost drowned trying to save Junessa. Wolf was quiet for a long moment, studying Christian's face with those intelligent gray eyes. You know, I've been writing for 40 years. Seen a lot of accidents, lost some good people along the way. And there's one thing I've learned about survivor's guilt: it'll eat you alive if you let it. This isn't survivor's guilt, Christian protested. This is pattern recognition. I teach people to be brave and they get hurt. Or, Wolf said calmly, you teach people to be brave and they live fuller, richer lives because of it. Saphira told me about the climbing instruction 15 years ago. You know what she didn't tell you? That experience didn't just teach her to overcome her fear of heights. It taught her that she was stronger than she thought, brave enough to pursue a career where she saves lives every day. Christian felt his throat tighten. But Jake was an experienced climber who made his own choices, Wolf interrupted gently. Anchor failures happen. Equipment fails. That's why we use redundant systems, why we practice safety protocols. But sometimes accidents happen anyway, and that's not the fault of the person who taught someone to love the mountains. You don't understand, Christian said, his voice breaking. I was supposed to be there. We had planned to climb Mount Hood together, but I canceled at the last minute because of work. If I had been there, if I had been checking his gear, you might have died with him, Wolf said bluntly. Or you might have made the same mistakes he made. Or maybe nothing would have been different at all. But you can't live your life believing that your presence could have prevented every tragedy. Christian pressed his palms against his eyes, feeling the weight of 3 years of suppressed grief and guilt. I don't know how to let go of it. The responsibility, the blame. You start by honoring what Jake would have wanted for you, Wolf said. Did your brother want you to stop living because he died? No, Christian admitted. Jake always said I worried too much, that I needed to take more risks, not fewer. Then maybe the best way to honor his memory is to live the kind of life he would have encouraged you to live. A life that includes love, connection, and yes, even risk. That evening, Christian found himself standing on Saphira's front porch, his heart hammering as he worked up the courage to knock. When she opened the door, her face showed a mixture of relief and caution. I'm sorry, Christian said before she could speak. I'm sorry for pulling away, for making you think you did something wrong. You didn't. This is all on me. Saphira studied his face for a moment, then stepped aside to let him in. Junessa's at a sleepover, she said quietly. We can talk without interruptions. They settled on her couch, the same spot where they had discovered their past connection days earlier. But the atmosphere now was charged with unspoken tension and unresolved emotion. I've been thinking about what you said, Saphira began. About teaching people to be brave being dangerous. And I think you're wrong. Christian started to protest, but she held up a hand to stop him. Let me finish. You taught me to climb that wall 15 years ago. And yes, that lesson in courage eventually led me to become a paramedic, which put me in situations where I could get hurt. But it also means I've saved dozens of lives over the years. If you hadn't given me that confidence, those people might have died, but you almost drowned trying to save Junessa, Christian pointed out. And you saved us both, Saphira replied. Using skills and instincts that came from the same place as your teaching, your fundamental belief that people are worth risking everything for. Christian felt tears burning his eyes. I blamed myself for Jake's death. I convinced myself that if I hadn't encouraged him to be an adventurous person, he would still be alive. Maybe he would be, Saphira said gently. But would he have been happy? Would he have been the person you loved, the brother you remember? Christian thought about Jake's infectious enthusiasm for life, his determination to experience everything the world had to offer, his absolute refusal to let fear make his decisions for him. No, Christian whispered. Jake lived exactly the way he wanted to live. And he died doing something he loved. Then maybe the question isn't whether your teaching put him at risk, Sapphira said. Maybe the question is whether you want to honor his memory by continuing to live in fear, or by choosing to live with the same courage you taught others to find. I'm scared, Christian admitted. Scared of losing people I care about. Scared of being responsible for someone else getting hurt. Scared of loving you and Junessa and then having something terrible happen. Sapphira reached over and took his hands, her touch warm and steady. I know, and I'm scared too. Scared of caring about someone who might decide I'm too complicated, too much responsibility. Scared of Junessa getting attached to you and then losing another important person in her life. So what do we do? Christian asked. We choose courage, Sapphira said simply. We choose to trust that love is worth the risk, that connection is stronger than fear. We choose to believe that the best way to honor the people we've lost is to live fully in their memory. Christian looked into her dark eyes, seeing not just the confident woman she had become, but also the scared 16-year-old who had trusted him to help her find her bravery. And he saw something else, the possibility of a future that included not just survival, but joy. I want to try, he said quietly. I want to choose courage with you, Sapphira smiled. And Christian felt his heart skip in that familiar way that meant everything was about to change. Then let's be brave together. When they kissed, it felt like coming home and jumping off a cliff all at the same time, terrifying and perfect and absolutely right. And for the first time since Jake's death, Christian allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the best parts of his life were still ahead of him. 2 months after their emotional breakthrough, Christian stood in his apartment above the hardware store, staring at his reflection in the bathroom mirror as he prepared for what might be the most important evening of his life. Tonight was the Midnight Wolves' annual autumn gathering, a celebration that marked the end of riding season and the beginning of their winter community service projects. But for Christian, tonight represented something much more significant. Tonight, he was going to ask Sapphira to marry him. The ring sat in a small velvet box on his kitchen counter, not a traditional diamond, but a unique piece crafted by Wolf's nephew, a metalsmith who specialized in custom jewelry for the motorcycle community. The band was forged from titanium and accented with small sapphires that reminded Christian of Sapphira's eyes. Engraved inside were the words that had become their motto, "Choose courage." Christian had been carrying the ring for 2 weeks, waiting for the perfect moment. But he had finally realized that perfect moments weren't found. They were created by two people choosing to be vulnerable with each other. Gathering was being held at Sunset Ranch, a sprawling property owned by Wolf's extended family about 20 miles outside Thornfield Valley. When Christian arrived on the motorcycle he had finally purchased, a used Harley that Wolf had helped him find and restore, the place was already alive with activity. String lights hung between oak trees, creating a magical canopy over picnic tables laden with homemade food. A bonfire crackled in a stone circle near the main barn, surrounded by chairs and benches where club members and their families relaxed with drinks and conversation. The sound of laughter and country music filled the crisp autumn air. Christian spotted Sapphira immediately. She stood near the horseshoe pit, wearing jeans and a soft burgundy sweater that complemented her dark hair, cheering enthusiastically as Junessa attempted to land a ringer. The sight of them together, his chosen family, made Christian's chest tight with emotion. "Uncle Christian," Junessa called when she spotted him, abandoning her horseshoe game to run over for a hug. She had started calling him uncle about a month ago, a designation that still made Christian's heart skip with joy. "How's the horseshoe champion doing?" Christian asked, lifting her off the ground in a spin that made her giggle. "I'm terrible at it, but Maria says practice makes progress, not perfect." Junessa replied with the wisdom of someone who had clearly been listening to the adults in her life. "Maria's a smart woman," Christian agreed, setting Junessa down and accepting a kiss on the cheek from Sapphira. "You look nervous," Sapphira observed, studying his face with the perceptive eyes that never missed anything. "Good nervous, or bad nervous? Christian asked, trying to keep his tone light. That depends on what you're nervous about, she replied with a smile that suggested. She knew he was up to something. The evening progressed, with the easy warmth that characterized all Midnight Wolves gatherings. Christian found himself in conversations about everything from motorcycle maintenance to Junessa's latest school project to the club's upcoming toy drive for underprivileged children. He marveled, not for the first time, at how completely his assumptions about this community had been wrong. As the sun set and the bonfire became the main source of light, Wolf called for everyone's attention. The big man stood near the fire, his weathered face serious but warm in the flickering light. Brothers and sisters, Wolf began, his voice carrying easily across the gathered crowd. We come together tonight to celebrate another year of writing, another year of looking out for each other, another year of proving that family isn't just about blood, it's about choice. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the group. This year, we've been blessed to welcome new family members, Wolf continued, his eyes finding Christian in the crowd. People who've shown us that courage comes in many forms, that heroism isn't about leather jackets or loud pipes, it's about being willing to risk everything for someone else's well-being. Christian felt heat rise in his cheeks as the gathering applauded, but he also felt a deep sense of belonging that still amazed him. Before we get too sentimental, Wolf said with a grin, let's eat some of Susan's famous chili before it gets cold. As the group began to disperse toward the food tables, Christian caught Saphira's hand. Walk with me? He asked. They strolled away from the main gathering, following a path that led to a small pond at the edge of the property. The water reflected the stars and the distant glow of the bonfire, creating a scene that felt almost magical in its serenity. I love this, Saphira said softly, settling onto a wooden bench that overlooked the water. Being part of something bigger than myself, watching Junessa grow up surrounded by people who love her unconditionally, even though they're not her blood family? Christian asked, sitting beside her. Especially because they're not, Saphira replied. They chose to love her, chose to make her part of their lives. That kind of love is rare. Christian took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the ring box in his jacket pocket. I've been thinking a lot about choice lately. About the choices we make when we're scared, when we're uncertain about the future. What kind of choices? Saphira asked, turning to face him more fully. The choice to trust someone with your heart, Christian said. The choice to believe that love is worth the risk of loss. The choice to build a life with someone, even when you can't guarantee what tomorrow will bring. Saphira's eyes widened slightly, and Christian could see that she understood where this conversation was heading. I spent 3 years believing that the safest way to live was alone, Christian continued. That if I didn't care too much about anyone, I couldn't be hurt again. But you and Junessa taught me that safety isn't the same thing as living. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the ring box, his hands trembling slightly as he dropped to one knee on the grass beside the bench. Saphira Dreneth, he said, his voice thick with emotion. 15 years ago, you trusted me to teach you to be brave. Tonight, I'm asking you to teach me the same thing. I'm asking you to marry me, to build a family with me, to choose courage with me every day for the rest of our lives. Saphira's hands flew to her mouth, tears streaming down her cheeks in the starlight. Christian, she whispered. I know it's complicated, Christian continued. I know we both have histories and fears and responsibilities. But I love you, and I love Junessa, and I want to spend my life proving that some risks are worth taking. Yes, Saphira said, laughing through her tears. Of course, yes. I love you too, more than I thought was possible. Christian slipped the ring onto her finger, marveling at how perfectly it fit, as if it had been waiting for this moment as long as they had. When he stood and kissed her, he could hear cheering from the direction of the bonfire. Apparently their private moment hadn't been as private as they had thought. Did they know you were going to propose? Saphira asked, wiping tears from her cheeks. Wolf might have had some idea, Christian admitted. He helped me pick out the ring. They walked back toward the gathering hand in hand, Sapphira occasionally stopping to admire her ring in the firelight. When they rejoined the group, they were immediately surrounded by congratulations, hugs, and offers to help plan the wedding. "Can I be in the wedding?" Junessa asked, bouncing with excitement. "Can I wear a fancy dress? Can we have dancing?" "You can be whatever you want to be in the wedding," Sapphira assured her. "It's going to be our day, all three of us." As the evening wound down and the bonfire burned low, Christian found himself sitting with his arm around Sapphira, watching Junessa toast marshmallows with Maria's help. The conversation flowed around them, discussions of wedding plans, motorcycle trips they wanted to take as a family, the house they were already talking about buying together. "I have something for you too," Sapphira said quietly, pulling a small wrapped package from her purse. Christian opened it to find a leather keychain with a small metal climbing carabiner attached. Engraved on the carabiner were the words, "Trust the rope," "Trust the rope." "Jake's favorite saying," Christian whispered, recognizing the phrase his brother had used whenever they were preparing for a difficult climb. "I thought maybe it was time to trust the rope again," Sapphira said. "To believe that the connections we make with each other, with this family, with the future we're building, are strong enough to hold us." Christian kissed her forehead, overwhelmed by the depth of her understanding. "I love you," he said simply. "I love you too," she replied. "And I can't wait to spend the rest of my life choosing courage with you." As they sat together under the stars, surrounded by their chosen family and planning their future, Christian realized that Jake had been right about so many things. Sometimes you did have to trust that the rope would hold. Sometimes you had to jump without knowing exactly where you would land. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, you discovered that the most important adventures in life weren't about climbing mountains or conquering fears. They were about finding the people who made you brave enough to love again. 6 months after their engagement, Christian stood in the doorway of what would soon become their shared home, watching Sapphira and Junessa paint the walls of what they had designated as the family room. The 3-bedroom house on Oakwood Drive was nothing fancy, a 1980s ranch style with good bones and a large backyard, but it represented something neither Christian nor Sapphira had ever experienced. A fresh start built on intention rather than circumstance. "Uncle Christian, come help us decide between sage green and ocean blue," Junessa called from where she knelt next to paint samples taped to the wall. At 10 years old, she had appointed herself the family's chief interior designer, a role she took with delightful seriousness. "What does your heart tell you?" Christian asked, kneeling beside her to examine the color options. "My heart says both, but Aunt Sapphira says that's not how paint works," Junessa replied with the exaggerated frustration of someone whose artistic vision was being constrained by practical limitations. Christian looked over at Sapphira, who was rolling primer on the far wall while humming softly to herself. She wore old jeans and one of his flannel shirts, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, and Christian felt that familiar flutter in his chest that still surprised him with its intensity. "What if we did sage green in here and saved ocean blue for your bedroom?" Christian suggested to Junessa. "Can we really pick any color for my room?" Junessa's eyes lit up with possibility. "Within reason," Sapphira called from across the room, not pausing in her painting. "And by within reason, I mean nothing that glows in the dark or requires special ventilation." Their house hunting process had been an adventure in compromise and communication. Christian had wanted something practical and low maintenance. Sapphira had wanted character and charm. Junessa had wanted a big yard for the dog they had all agreed she could get once they were settled. The Oakwood Drive house checked all their boxes while staying within the budget they had carefully calculated based on combining their incomes. Wedding planning had proceeded with similar collaboration and intentionality. They had decided on a small ceremony at Sunset Ranch, surrounded by the Midnight Wolves family and a few other close friends. Saphira's dress was simple and elegant, ordered online after a single shopping trip that had left them both laughing about the absurdity of spending thousands of dollars on something worn once. Christian's suit was borrowed from Wolf, who had insisted that family took care of family, but the real work of building their life together was happening in moments like this: choosing paint colors, discussing household budgets, figuring out bedtime routines that worked for all three of them. Christian had moved some of his tools into the garage, where he was slowly building custom furniture for their home. Saphira had claimed the kitchen as her domain, though she was teaching both Christian and Junessa to cook with varying degrees of success. "Dad's coming home for the wedding," Junessa announced suddenly, looking up from her paint samples. Aunt Saphira got the email this morning. Christian felt a complex mix of emotions at this news. He was genuinely happy that Marcus would be able to attend their wedding and reunite with his daughter after almost a year overseas. But he was also nervous about meeting the man whose approval, though not technically required, felt important for their family's future harmony. "That's wonderful news," Christian said, meaning it. "Are you excited to see him?" "Yes, but also worried," Junessa admitted with the emotional honesty that children possessed before they learn to hide their feelings. "What if he doesn't like that I have a new uncle? What if he wants me to come live with him somewhere else?" Saphira set down her paint roller and came over to kneel beside Junessa, her expression gentle but serious. "Sweetheart, your dad and I have talked about this. He knows how much you love it here, how well you're doing in school, how happy you are with the Midnight Wolves family. No one is going to make you leave if you don't want to. But what about when his deployment is over?" Junessa pressed. "Where will we all live then?" Christian and Saphira exchanged glances over Junessa's head. They had discussed this scenario extensively, working through various possibilities depending on where Marcus was stationed next and what his preferences were for Junessa's continued care. "We'll figure it out together," Christian said. "All of us, including your dad. Families are complicated sometimes, but that doesn't make them less real or less strong." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of motorcycles pulling into their driveway. Through the window, Christian could see Wolf and several other club members dismounting from their bikes, their arms full of pizza boxes and grocery bags. "Looks like the work crew has arrived with lunch," Saphira observed with a smile. The Midnight Wolves had adopted their house renovation as a community project, with different members contributing skills and labor on weekends. Wolf and Tony had helped Christian install new flooring in the bedrooms. Maria and Susan had organized a painting party for the exterior. Even Junessa's classmates had been recruited to help with yard work, turning the renovation into a social event that strengthened their connections throughout Thornfield Valley. As the afternoon progressed, and their small house filled with laughter, conversation, and the productive chaos of multiple people working toward a common goal, Christian found himself stepping back to observe the scene with wonder. A year ago, he had been eating lunch alone in his truck, counting the hours until he could retreat to his empty apartment. Now he was surrounded by people who had chosen to spend their Saturday helping him build a home. "Penny for your thoughts," Saphira said, appearing at his side with a cold beer. "Just thinking about how different everything is," Christian replied, accepting the drink gratefully. "How much better? Any regrets?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "Only that it took me so long to find you again," Christian said, wrapping his arm around her waist. "And that Jake isn't here to see this." "I think he would have liked our chaos," Saphira said, leaning into his embrace. "He would have loved all of you," Christian agreed. "Especially Junessa. He always said he wanted to be the fun uncle someday." As the sun began to set and their friends started to pack up their tools, Christian realized that building a life together wasn't just about choosing paint colors or combining households. It was about creating space for each other's histories while building new traditions. that honored both their past experiences and their future hopes. It was about showing up consistently, having difficult conversations with love and patience, and trusting that their foundation was strong enough to support whatever challenges lay ahead. Tomorrow they would continue painting. Next weekend they would install the new kitchen cabinets Wolf had helped Christian build. And in 6 weeks, they would stand together at Sunset Ranch and promise to keep choosing courage, keep choosing each other, for whatever adventures awaited their growing family. 3 years after Christian Draymond jumped into Willow Creek Lake to save 2 strangers, Thornfield Valley had transformed in ways no one could have predicted. The change started small, almost invisible, but like ripples spreading across still water. It touched every corner of the community. It began with the motorcycle safety course that Christian and the Midnight Wolves started teaching at the community center every spring. What had started as a way to give back became a bridge between the club and nervous parents who wanted their teenagers to ride responsibly. Christian found himself teaching confidence and risk assessment to young people, sharing lessons about courage and calculated bravery that honored Jake's memory while keeping new riders safe. The success of that program led to others. Safira began offering first aid classes for families, turning the community center into an informal training ground where neighbors learned to take care of each other. Wolf's Auto Shop started a scholarship program for students interested in mechanical trades, creating pathways for young people who might otherwise have felt overlooked by traditional education systems. But the most profound change was harder to measure, a shift in how Thornfield Valley residents saw each other. The story of the construction worker who had risked everything to save the biker family became local legend, told and retold until it evolved into something larger than the facts. It became proof that assumptions could be wrong, that heroism came in unexpected packages, that choosing community over fear could transform everyone involved. Mrs. Henderson from the flower shop now organized monthly potluck dinners that brought together families who had never spoken before. The high school started a peer mentorship program modeled after the Midnight Wolves' approach to chosen family. Even the town council changed, adding voices that reflected the community's growing understanding that strength came from diversity, not uniformity. Christian often stood in the backyard of their Oakwood Drive home, watching Junessa play with the neighborhood kids while Safira tended her garden, marveling at how ordinary their extraordinary life had become. Marcus had returned from deployment and decided to settle permanently in Thornfield Valley, building a house 3 blocks away so Junessa could maintain the stability she had found while staying close to her father. The friendship bracelet Junessa had made him that first week still circled Christian's wrist, faded now but unbroken. It reminded him daily that sometimes the most important rescues were mutual, that in saving others, we save ourselves, and that love multiplies when shared rather than diminishing. On quiet evenings, when the motorcycles were parked and the community center was dark, Christian would think about the moment he had chosen to jump into dangerous water for people he didn't know. He understood now that it hadn't been a single act of heroism, but the beginning of a life lived with intention, connection, and the kind of courage that created families from strangers and turned small towns into homes. The ripples were still spreading, carrying hope to shores not yet imagined. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.